Let me begin by thanking Zsolt and Uwe and their very efficient staffs in the Central European University and the Hungarian Political Science Association for having me here in a city that is in some ways my family's native city. My father was born here. My family lived here for a long time, and it was one of those Hungarian families that represents the tradition of diversity and complexity and assimilation that is typically Hungarian. There's a Protestant Lutheran branch of my family, there's a Catholic branch of my family, there's a Jewish branch of my family, there are people from originally Czech, as you see from the name, originally Austrian, people Hungarian as far back as we know, people who sort of changed their identity at various times or couldn't decide which identity they had. And I would like to dedicate this lecture to one member of that family who was active in Hungary almost 100 years ago, and after whom I was named. In the Hungarian order of the name, Fleiszig András, who was my grandmother's brother, who was an independent scholar. And I found out to my surprise, after I wrote my first article on European integration, arguing that it was largely economically motivated by states pursuing instrumental interests, that in 1930 he had written a book called, and I'll cite the name of the German translation, Plan Europa, die soziale und wirtschaftliche Zukunft Europas. Plan Europe, the social and economic future of Europe, in which he argued that Europe should integrate based on a kind of international corporatism based on greater free trade, more class compromise between capital and labor, the necessity of organizing agriculture into something like a common agricultural policy. There are certain aspects of it we might not accept today. He was very accepting, for example, of international cartels that we might find a little odd today. But a surprising amount of it, I found, almost eerily, were like things I had written 70 years later. I'm also very happy to be sharing the panel with Philippe Schmitter. Philippe, in the grand tradition of political science, is one of those people who disagrees with me even when he agrees with me. And if my family's any indication, that's a good quality to bring to a conference in Hungary. But he's one of the great comparativists of our times, as Uwe mentioned, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. I'd like to speak today on the issue of the democratic deficit, or the democratic legitimacy of the European Union, because the issue of the democratic deficit never seems to go away. People constantly seem to feel, to judge by what's published in academia or what you read in newspapers, that there's something suspicious about the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. They feel this because they feel that the subjective support of the European Union is somehow soft or weak, that when it's put to the test of democratic legitimacy in referenda or in polls or in party competition, that it comes up short, that it doesn't have as much support as it should, that when people are polled, they claim that they don't have voice in the European Union. If you look at the most recent Eurobarometer, less than a third of Europeans feel they have a voice in Europe as compared to over half who feel they do in their nation states. And similarly, objectively, people feel that the European Union has somehow failed to meet the needs of Europeans more recently. People blame the EU as undemocratic, and it's not hard to see why. It seems distant, technocratic, and criticisms of this kind for the EU being undemocratic have become the lingua franca of debates within Europe. Anybody who criticizes the European Union throws in a statement about its undemocratic nature. Now, one might point out at the start that in fact these criticisms are somewhat curious, almost seem to cancel each other out, because they come from all parts of the political spectrum. So the right wing criticizes the undemocratic nature of the European Union because they argue that somehow it's creeping social regulation of some kind. So if you talk to British Eurosceptics, that's what they'll tell you. The left wing criticizes Europe because it seems insufficiently socialist, as some kind of a plot by right-wing libertarians. And the centrists criticize Europe because it seems like a system that benefits special interests or strengthens extremists at the cost of the center. It's unable to make decisions that would benefit everybody. They can't all be right at the same time. And you might say this is just a kind of public debate that has very little meaning, except that political scientists seem to have taken up this same call. If you look at the literature, although it's changed a little bit in recent years, there's still a solid majority of political scientists who seems to think there's something fundamentally suspicious about the democratic pedigree of the European Union. I want to argue that the European Union is as democratic as its constituent member states, and that in fact most of the arguments against it being democratically legitimate aren't just factually false, but violate principles about the analysis of democratic societies that we teach undergraduates in basic courses about political analysis. So what I'm going to do is take a set of principles about politics that most of us, were we analyzing a domestic political system, Hungary, the United States, or a comparative politics course of any kind, would consider unproblematic, obvious, trivial. Apply them to the European Union, and I think if you do that, what you find is that the democratic problems, with one possible exception, which I'll discuss, is, from a democratic point of view, relatively unproblematic. The starting point for this analysis is to understand the first principle, which again, we teach all undergraduates, that modern democracy is constitutional, not populist or plebiscitary. So most criticisms of the European Union start by saying, isn't it obvious that this institution can't be democratic because people are not very involved in European Union politics, either at the international level or even at the domestic level. Permanent mass participation in European issues seems notably absent. And this criticism you find even in areas, even from people like Robert Dahl in debates. Yet we teach undergraduates that permanent mass participation on every issue all the time is neither desirable nor feasible in most political systems. Instead, we very carefully differentiate where there is participation and where there is not, according to a constitutional framework. And the EU is part of the superordinate constitutional framework that governs most European countries today. Why do we do this? Well, we do this for a number of reasons. One is to protect the rights of minorities. So we have clauses for human rights, and although the EU is less involved in this than, say, the Council of Europe, some of the concerns about rights or about democracy that people have to do with the rights of people like asylum seekers or the rights of individuals that are protected under these kinds of international regimes, and those are exactly like the sort of rights that we protect at home. A second reason is that we seek to control factions. We limit democracy because we think special interests will dominate democracy, and we in fact insulate democratic politics deliberately from the free play of democratic forces in order to block those special interests. No country in the world would implement trade liberalization were it not for the insulation of trade policy from the free play of open competition of political forces. For example, my same European friends who are critics of the democratic deficit in Europe often ask me when the United States is going to become more forthcoming on trade policy. The whole key to trade liberalization in the United States for the last 70 years, since the 1930s, has been to take trade policy out of the hands of Congress, out of the hands of direct electoral competition, and put it into the hands of the president, who acts under very carefully insulated procedures to promote trade liberalization. Most people feel this is in the interest of the median voter, interest of society as a whole, not just as an abstract proposition of economics, but actually in real political terms. But if you put it in the hands of special interests within Congress, it never happens. And the third, and I will argue most important reason why most decisions are not plebiscitary or populist, but are constitutional, is informational. Most people, most of the time, do not pay attention to most issues, and even sometimes don't pay attention to issues that are correlated with the issues at hand. This problem of informational incapacity of publics is particularly acute in the case of the EU, because the EU deals with very few salient issues. Now let me make this point very clear, because it is constantly misunderstood. The EU deals with important issues, issues that are important to all of us, that are costly to people, that redistribute income from people to one person to another. But it deals with relatively few issues that are salient. What's the difference between an important issue and a salient issue? A salient issue is an issue that consistently, over time, mobilizes publics to organize and vote in a consistent manner. In most Western democracies, those issues include fiscal policy, spending, taxation, healthcare, pensions, education, crime, housing, and macroeconomic performance. With the exception, and I'll come back to this exception in a moment, of the relationship between monetary policy and macroeconomic performance. None of these issues are EU issues. And the list of issues I just read are the list of issues that people responded were the most important issues to them or their nation when polled in the Eurobarometer poll. And those polls don't change very much over time or across countries. In every country, it's taxing and spending, it's healthcare, it's pensions, it's education, it's crime, it's housing that people care about. You have to get down to number 9, the environment, which is kind of an EU issue some of the time. Immigration, which is kind of an EU issue some of the time. Not third country immigration, actually, but, and energy issues, which might become an EU issue sometime, before you get to things that are EU issues. And when you recall that most voters can keep in their mind 1 issue or 2 issues or 3 issues at a time, the electorate as a whole can keep in mind 4 issues, 5 issues at a time. What you see is that the informational capacity of publics to deal with the EU is limited, because nothing that the EU does is very important to them. What happens if people are faced with a political system with only non-salient issues? They have no incentive to generate consistent positions, consistent information, consistent ideological stances, and they end up engaging, as I'll get to in a moment, in random political behavior. Therefore, these tend to be the kind of issues that one delegates to political parties, or one delegates them to legislatures, or one delegates them to expert Crimea. And in fact, the EU is destined to do this because it's very difficult to get structured political participation around the EU. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the standard for judging an institution like the EU ought not to be how much participation is there, but is it an appropriate constitutional structure for the kind of issues that it deals with? Now, what are those issues like? Well, some people think they aren't very many, but they're loud. Some people think that the EU itself ought to be significantly scaled back, and that we ought not to have very much international cooperation at all and not have very much sovereignty pooled or delegated to central authorities. And this falls afoul of the second thing that we teach undergraduates about modern policymaking, which is the world is interdependent. We can't turn the clock backwards. Countries need to make policy in common, and they need to make credible commitments to those policies. Otherwise, other countries can't make the investments in that policy that will make the policy work. And this fact is important not just pragmatically. That is to say, it's important not just because countries benefit from cooperation against which they sacrifice some sort of democratic benefits. It's important democratically. That is to say, one of the choices that a democratic public has today is the choice to expand the ambit of their constitutional order to include this kind of cooperation with other countries. This is the argument that Antonio and Abram Shays and others have made in the literature on international law, that part of modern sovereignty includes the right to contract with other countries into these kinds of arrangements. To limit that arbitrarily, or to take a sovereigntist position that says countries should not do that on its face, would be a limitation of democratic choice, not an expansion of that choice. So we live in a constitutional order, a world that is interdependent, where we need to deal with these choices in common, and a world in which most of these international issues are non-salient. So we can repose the question of democracy. We know that we cannot realistically expect to democratize at the international level, to create a European-level democracy. Most issues remain national. In fact, something on the order of 90% of the laws in Europe are national. Most of the salient issues, as we've seen, are national. Therefore, the center of gravity of European democracy will remain national. The central issue is, therefore, can the member states of the EU maintain appropriate domestic democratic control over these functions, appropriate accountability, appropriate transparency, balance between different functions of democracy, human rights protection, faction control, information, at the same level that one would expect them to do at home as they are cooperating and making credible commitments. That is the standard. Does democracy, domestic democracy, remain relatively similar to the way it was before? Or if there are any changes, are they justified by the kind of constitutional considerations that I mentioned before? And the answer to that question, I believe, is yes, that the European Union does remain largely as accountable, as transparent, and as balanced constitutionally as it did before. And let me provide some data to suggest that is the case. First, the nation state still maintains control, legitimacy, and real power over most of the things that people care about most. And it does so in a very directed and deliberate fashion. Jacques Delors famously predicted in 1988 that in 10 years, this is the exact quote he made, he said, in 10 years, 80% of economic and perhaps social and fiscal policy making will be of EU origin. So this is a prediction made in 1988 about what might happen with economic and social policy making. This quotation from Jacques Delors is widely cited. It's been cited by the German, former German president. It's been cited by major British newspapers as a fact about all European policymaking, that 80% of all European policymaking in all issues currently comes from Europe. In fact, that number is closer to 10%, and it's a very carefully crafted 10%. Member states are very careful to keep control over issues like social welfare provision, healthcare, pensions, active cultural policy, education, law and order, family policy, and so on. And none of these issues are likely to be communitarized anytime soon. In fact, it's more often that people criticize the EU for not doing more in these areas than for doing things. Now, I'm perfectly aware, because I read the Journal of Common Market Studies and all the other journals, of article after article that argues that there is this or that small aspect of these issue areas that gets influenced by EU policy. There is a cottage industry in showing that 1 or 2% of this or that issue gets affected by EU policy. But if you ask what the overall welfare system of major European countries looks like, and what the determinants of the reform possibilities are in those countries, those determinants are overwhelmingly domestic. And they remain domestic, and they will remain domestic for the foreseeable future. There is no European social policy. There will be no European social policy, because that's the way the member states and their electorates want it to be. And that's the most fundamental aspect of European democracy. Indeed, when you poll Europeans and ask them what do they want the European Union to do, Europeans respond with something that looks very much like what the European Union is doing now. They're in favor of it doing more in areas like soft foreign policy areas, defense and foreign affairs, fighting terrorism, protecting the environment, perhaps energy, regional policy, maybe even immigration and finance, fighting crime. Then they're sort of mildly positive about inflation, but when it comes to pensions, taxation, education, health, things like that, they're completely opposed. So they essentially support something very close to the status quo, and the status quo is what they get. Now, many people think that in daily legislation, the EU is a kind of runaway technocracy that works outside of the rules of normal democracy, a kind of superstate of some kind. But in fact, the outcome that I just mentioned, that it's quite limited in what it does, not only extends to everyday legislation, but in fact must do so. It must do so because it's encoded into the constitutional structure of the European Union. It's not just that the European Union is a polity without fiscal prowess, without the ability to tax. So the European Union is responsible only for 2% of European public spending, which immediately means that it can't be involved in any sort of fiscally rich activity like education, like healthcare, like pensions, like social welfare spending, and can't ever be barring a fundamental transformation. But it's also true that it's responsible only for a tiny fraction, again, 2 or 3%, of European bureaucracy. Its bureaucracy, 20 or 30,000 people, is the size of a small European city. That means it also can't administer any major programs, which it turns over to countries. There are many studies in the EU literature now of decision-making within the Council, and now increasingly, I'm thinking, for example, of Daniel Finke and other people, studies of decision-making in IGCs. And all of them show that that decision-making is heavily influenced by democratic criteria, by the interests of economic groups, and by, increasingly, when you're dealing with ideologically rich issues like institutional change, by public opinion as well. So there is overwhelming evidence within the literature that the EU is, in fact, responsive. Why? That brings us to the next thing that we teach undergraduates. We teach undergraduates that indirect political controls can be as powerful as direct political controls, that you don't need to have mass elections to influence policy or even interest group pressure. You can do it in other ways. How does the EU do it? Two things are important. One is separation of powers, checks and balances. The EU is the ultimate checks and balances polity. It's like Switzerland or the United States squared, right? When you think as a political scientist about how you pass legislation in the EU, right? I mean, de facto, a group of diplomats or heads of state in the Council, European Council, set an agenda. That agenda gets interpreted by a technocratic body, the Commission, that makes a proposal to another diplomatic body that decides, supposedly by qualified supermajority, but actually by consensus or consensus -1. It then sends it to a parliament that has to decide by absolute majority. It shuttles back and forth to an agreement. They then send it to an entirely different branch of government, level of government, the nation states, for implementation, overseen by an independent court. If you describe this to a political scientist in the abstract, the political scientist would say that political system can never work. It's impossible that it would work. Why? Because there's too much input. Because too many people are influencing that system. Because everybody has a say in the European system. It does work because the EU is a highly interdependent polity in which people restrict themselves to legislation that is supported by a large consensus of Europeans and set the other ones aside. Similarly, Europeans can influence their national governments even indirectly, and those national governments reflect their interests in Brussels. So what we see is that the same sort of indirect political controls that work at the national level seem to be working at the international level. Now, some people object to this sort of view, and they say, that sounds good, and it's nice that there are political scientists out there who can show this with their models. But every time you actually ask the European voters what they think about the European Union, isn't it true that the European voters vote against it? So they say, look at these referenda, the Irish referendum and the French referendum and the Dutch referendum. Doesn't that show that Europeans don't, in fact, favor the European Union? All right, so now we come to the next thing that we teach undergraduates. We teach undergraduates that referendums are very unreliable. They're very unreliable for the same reasons I talked about at the start of the lecture. That in a constitutional democracy, the voters are often quite ignorant or arbitrary in their judgments about specific issues. if they vote in an organized way in elections, it's because there are highly salient issues or highly salient ideological cleavages which structure their action. But give them a referendum, and worse, give them a referendum solely about non-salient issues, and their behavior becomes chaotic and random. So consider the Irish referendum, the first Irish referendum. If you look at most people do when they analyze referenda is they read the elite press. So they say, the Irish voted down the referendum. I wonder why. So they say, let's go read some Irish newspapers. And a bunch of smart Irish people give you a bunch of reasons why they voted it down. What you should look at is exit polls and voting behavior studies to find out why Irish do what they do. And if you read those, what you find is that nobody, first of all, nobody, like almost 0% of the Irish, voted because of anything in the Constitution. In fact, the largest single reason cited for voting against the Constitution was, it was almost 40% of the no votes, was because they had absolutely no idea what was in it. And most of the other people who voted against it either because they believed something to be in it that wasn't, demonstrably wasn't, or for reasons that had nothing to do with Europe at all. And in fact, it is striking that Europe as an issue hasn't played an important role in a domestic election in Western Europe. I set aside the enlargement countries because there was a large national choice being made, but hasn't played an important role in a Western European national election probably for about 40 years. I mean, the last example I can really think of is the first round of the French elections in 1965. Why? Because these are non-salient issues. Referenda tell us nothing. What does tell us something? Well, ask people. Ask people what they think about the European Union. Well, if you do that, and you probably read the headlines, what you find is about 43% of the people trust the European Union, and this number has gone down slightly recently. It used to be 46, and 10 years ago it was 50. And actually, it's now slightly outweighed by the number of people who distrust the European Union, 45%. So isn't that evidence that people distrust the European Union? Well, that would make sense unless you compared it to the numbers about national governments. So if you compare it to people about national governments, only 28% of Europeans trust their national governments. So either you think all politics are illegitimate in Europe, which is a position you could take, or you have to admit that the European Union is in fact more legitimate than the national polities on which it rests. And you'll remember that the standard I set forth at the start of this lecture was that the European Union should maintain or improve the democratic legitimacy of the polities on which it's based. Now, some people disagree with this, and they say, well, that's very clever. You know, you're a professor from Princeton, you're a good debater, but the problem is that both national governments and the European Union have been taking out of the hands of people the decisions that really matter. So they are fed up with politics, they're disillusioned. If they participated more in things that mattered, then they would care more about politics. Democracy, in this view, creates trust. Participation creates trust. People believe in institutions in which they participate. Now, this sounds nice, and I guess if you're in high school, it's the kind of thing we teach people this in America in high school. I suppose we probably teach it to people in Hungary too. But I don't think we teach undergraduates this, right? Because the data actually doesn't support it. What the data supports is that no matter how you measure it, the trust, the legitimacy, the support is higher in modern democracies for non-majoritarian institutions than majoritarian institutions. People don't trust parliaments or trust institutions in which they participate. They trust institutions in which they don't participate. Now, that's not to say we all should be living in China, right? Democracy is more trusted than non-democracy, but within a democracy, it does not follow that more democracy is more legitimate, precisely for the reasons that I said at the start. We live in a constitutional democracy in which these things need to be balanced. So look at the data again. Across the EU, 70% of the people trust the army. It's amazing, actually. Americans are used to thinking, well, we're the militaristic people, and Europeans are, you know, as we used to say in my home state of Oregon, where we decriminalize drugs and so on, peace, love, and dope. But so 70% trust the army, 64% trust the police, 47% trust the national court system, but only 31% trust their own parliament, and only 15% trust their own political parties. Only 28% trust their own government, compared to the 43% that trust the European Union. So you have to relativize these statistics to the realm of the possible. We live in difficult times, and by the standards by which we should reasonably judge these things, people tend to trust the EU more than other institutions. Now there are finally, there are those who say that if we change the institutions to make them more participatory in some way, that people would like them better. So this is the argument that's been directed at me by Hicks and Follestall. It's the kind of argument Habermas makes, that we should direct debate around certain ideals that Europeans share in common. My argument is that meaningful political participation, investment in information, in mobilization, from people who have other things to do with their time, does not come from ideals and institutions alone, it comes from common interests. And in a polity like the EU that doesn't have those convergent interests, you can't generate that kind of participation. Still, and this is my final point, every democracy is imperfect. And there are two implications of this. The first is, this standard I use, that the EU needs to meet or improve the standards of democratic accountability properly understood in a constitutional sense in the domestic polities, in the national systems, can be used as a critical tool as well. And I would use it to criticize the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is more independent than any central bank in a developed country. And as far as I can see, with no technocratic or political justification. It's obvious why it is independent. If you study bargaining between countries and the foundation of the central bank and German traditions in central banking and so on, those of us who study the history of the EU understand why the European Central Bank is independent. But from a democratic theory standpoint, it's not clear why the European Central Bank, reigning over a diverse, non-optimal currency area, should be more independent than national central banks. Although, we should remember that central banking is a recognized exception where we don't expect the polity to be entirely democratic. We don't expect democracy to rule. We don't expect monetary policy to be made by popular vote, but we would expect it to be more democratic, perhaps, than the European Central Bank is. And I think the biases in the application of current central bank policy, some of them at least, perhaps follow from this. My own view is it's not a particularly wise policy from a technocratic point of view, at least for some countries within the Eurozone. But there's a democratic aspect to that as well. The second implication of every democracy being imperfect is if it is true that the EU is part of now the democratic system in every member state, it means it can sometimes improve democracy in member states, and it is a good thing, for example, if the EU insulates trade policy from special interests or protects human rights in countries that are unwilling to protect the human rights of their own citizens to international standards. So in conclusion, I call for a return to reality, not just the reality of common sense, but the reality of what we teach every undergraduate in the first couple of weeks of a course and what we read in the works of the great political philosophers. But what we tend to forget when we get involved in analysis of the European Union and other multilateral institutions and their relationship to democracy. We forget that modern democracies are constitutional, that the world is interdependent, that most international issues are non-salient and therefore need to be treated in some way other than simply encouraging participation, that the nation state remains the most powerful political institution of our time, that indirect political control via and through the nation state is efficacious, that referenda are unreliable, that increased democracy does not create political trust or political control, that ideals and institutions don't establish democracy, but interests do, and that every democracy is imperfect. If we keep our minds on these realities, I think we'll straighten out what's been a regrettable episode in the public debate within Europe. Thank you very much.